Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we were going to look at chapter 5 of Minsky Matters. Basically, since the World War II, there has been a goal of elimination of poverty. Now, this is a story which is much longer and more complex than appears to be on the surface, because actually the meaning of poverty has changed over time, and the idea that the poverty is a social problem is also a new idea. It didn't exist. Previously, and in the Bible it is written that the poor you will always have with you. So poverty is a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a social problem. It was made into a social problem by the emergence of capitalism, in which people get only what they have, what they can earn. And so if a poor doesn't have a job, then he cannot eat. This was not the case in traditional societies. In traditional societies, the responsibility for feeding the poor was a collective responsibility of the society as a whole. If someone was poor, that meant that other people have the responsibility of making, those people who have more than what they need, they have the responsibility of giving it to the poor. If you look at the ahadith, they are quite strange in the sense, from our modern perspective, that the poor are told to conceal their poverty and the rich are supposed to find out who is needy and provide for them. So it is the opposite of what happens today. Anyway, once poverty emerged as a social problem in capitalism, then efforts were made to solve this problem. And so there was this war on poverty, but the war on poverty, which is basically the last half of the 20th century we're talking about, has not been very successful, and it has not been very successful because it is based on wrong theories about poverty. In particular, it says that the poor are poor because they don't have the skills, they don't have the education, they don't have... So basically the problem is with the poor, the blame lies on the poor. So we try to fix up the poor to make sure that the problem is removed. But actually this is not true. The fact is that if there are only a fixed number of jobs being generated by the economy, then no matter, and they are more poor, then regardless of how we train and educate the poor, they will be unemployed. There can be, as we can see, unemployed PhDs as well. It is the system which creates, the economic system which creates jobs in certain numbers according to certain conditions, which don't have to match how many poor there are. And this is the basic problem. The economic theory fails completely, and it says that the number of jobs created will match the number of the poor because of the supply and demand. But this is one of the fundamental issues which divides neoclassical theory from Keynesian theory, that and MMT, that the idea that the supply and demand of labor will be equal. Now, it's really surprising that the neoclassicals still believe this theory, because it has drastic implications. If you look at the world around you, you see that it's not true. And there is so much empirical evidence that the supply of labor is not equal to the demand of labor, that it's hard to believe. And that's why many people who have looked at how economists behave, they have been puzzled, because it's like somebody saying that it is midnight when the sun is shining. There is so much disparity between the economic theory and the real world that it is hard to understand how an economist can maintain this theory in the face of such evidence. For example, the Lucas theory, which he maintains today even, as far as I know, is that the laborer chooses whether or not he wants to work, and if he is out of work, that is his free choice, because he doesn't want to work at the going wage that he can receive. And so basically the Great Depression occurred because it was the Great Vacation. People decided that they didn't want to work at the going wages, and they would rather stand in bread lines rather than having jobs. So this is so ridiculous that it's hard to understand how but this is the theory that is currently being taught in Harvard of the labor market. It is not that this is something which is absurd and everybody agrees. So the theory of poverty is then that people are poor because they don't want to work at jobs. So somehow we have to convince them to work. Maybe if we give them better skills, then they will be able to get higher wages and so on. So once we understand that the theory is wrong, then we understand that we have to create more jobs for the people. That's one of the key Minsky ideas, that poverty is basically due to joblessness. And sufficient jobs are not created by the private sector. So we need to have the government create jobs. So we need a full employment program where the government acts as the employer of the last resort. It gives jobs to anybody who can't find a job in the private sector. So this is the key elements of the Minsky program. So Minsky himself, the author actually, Randall Wray, writes about his own personal experiences as a student of Minsky, and he says that I was very surprised by Minskys views, because he said that Minsky was opposed to AFDC, aid to family with dependents, and no social security, no food stamps. And so on the one hand we have this man who is arguing for jobs for everyone. On the other hand, he is arguing very strongly against social welfare. These two opinions are usually belong to different political schools of thought. There is the Reagan school, which says that no, just let free markets work and everything will be fine, and anytime the government interferes by providing social security, etc., it causes problems for the economy. So those people who hold these views, they are generally evil people, in the sense that what they want is, they want to make sure that people are desperate, so then the labor market will be easier and wages will be low and the capitalists will make more profits. The more benefits you provide to the poor, the stronger off they are in their bargaining position and the less exploitation they will accept. So most people who are basically, I've said in many different places, there are two economic theories. There is ET 1%, economic theory of the top 1%, and then there is ET 90%, which is the economic theory of the bottom 90%. And so people, and these two theories are opposed to each other. So people who have belong to ET 90%, they want to put theories, they support social security and support AFDC and support food stamps because they think that the poor should be helped. Now this guy, he is Minsky, he belongs to ET 90%, but he is up against these programs. So this is a little bit of a contradiction, and we will see why that is so later. So instead of these, he supports that idea that we should create jobs programs. Everyone who wants to work should be able to find work. And in the New Deal, which occurred after the Great Depression with Roosevelt, he said that they created large public programs to hire people because the private sector didn't have any jobs. And so basically the fiscal policy should consist of providing jobs to people. And the Fed, just like the Fed is the lender of the last resort, when the banks can't raise money, it provides them with money, so the government should be the employer of the last resort. If people can't find job, then government should give them a job. And so Minsky worked in the 1960s to promote job creation as an alternative to welfare. Now actually this lecture is all about how Keynesian theory was used and how it basically failed to do the job because it was based on wrong theories. So a post-war period was mostly one of prosperity. There was, and if you look at the numbers, they are very good. You have high growth rates, you have good wages, etc. But even in the middle of all of this prosperity, there was a lot of poverty. Michael Harrington wrote this book called The Other America, where everybody was enjoying, but there are very strong pockets of poverty, people who have not been touched by this prosperity. And this always happens. So in 1963, this created a sensitivity to poverty, and people thought that something should be done about it. And so Kennedy launched the program, and Johnson implemented it. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. In 1963, I was 8 years old, and I was in Hawaii. My father was working for the East-West Center. And I remember the day because there were no cartoons on that day. All day they were news reports about how Kennedy has been assassinated. And so after he was assassinated, Johnson took over, and he launched this war on poverty. And this had been initiated by Kennedy, but basically the problem was the Vietnam War, which was happening at that time, and that distracted them from being able to do a lot of social programs. But Minsky said that this war on poverty will fail because it does not contain significant job creation initiatives. And he thought that the central problem of the capitalist economy is involuntary unemployment, which is exactly the same thing that Keynes had also said. And the neoclassical diagnosis of involuntary unemployment, which they accepted at that time, although they later went back and repented and took it back, but at that point everybody had agreed. But the diagnosis was just that there is wage rigidity. So the real wage is different from the nominal wage, and there is money illusion, and that's the reason why there is involuntary unemployment. People can't, because the wage is stuck at too high a level. If the wage was allowed to go down, then so again, this is not the right problem, and this is not what Keynes said either, although initially he said something which was like that. So there is room for confusion and doubt about what Keynes said. But in the general theory, he clearly states that rigid wages is not the problem, and even with flexible wages, you will have involuntary unemployment. But this was never understood by the economists. Actually, this is a complex systems idea. There are some basic ideas which economists, even noble class caliber economists, do not understand. One is the complexity problem, that you cannot take micro theory and just replicate. This is the DSGE model, that you just have one agent in the economy, and every agent is just a replication of that same agent, so you can just... Similarly, when it comes to firm theory, supply and demand, you take one small firm, and then you just take n of them, and you add them up, and you get the aggregate demand. This is again false, because an effect which is small for one firm, when you add up all the firms, it becomes a big effect. And so the approximations that you make in the theory, which say that the firm's output does not have any effect on the price. This is true for one firm, but it is not true for the industry as a whole. And so these simple facts, it's really flabbergasting that the textbooks which are currently being taught make these elementary logical mistakes. So the involuntary unemployment problem is still not understood by economists. I have this lecture on 70 years of economists' failure to understand unemployment, and it continues to be true. And it's so basic that it's amazing that why people refuse to understand something so simple. So once you understand that it is not flexible wages that are needed, the private enterprise just doesn't generate enough jobs, and this will not change by flexing the wages, then you understand that the government must do some direct job creation. So this is the solution that Minsky proposes, that the government should be an employer of the last resort. It should provide a job guarantee program. And Minsky also thought that eliminating poverty and joblessness was essential to stabilizing an unstable economy. Basically, again, Minsky differs from neoclassicals in that neoclassicals think that the economy is fundamentally stable, it moves towards equilibrium, whereas Minsky thinks that the economy is fundamentally unstable. If it is in equilibrium, it will move out of equilibrium. So he says that the Keynesian demand management theory, which we have studied, which basically means that if you have unemployment, then the government should use expansionary monetary and fiscal policy to push the economy back to employment. This was the actual accepted theory post-World War until the 1970s, and this was used for policy making. According to Minsky, this adds to instability. This is not a good way to manage the economy. And basically, Minsky argued that we should not do the programs that were launched in War on Poverty, which were based on Keynesian ideas and basically providing training and skills to the to the laborers, and that should be replaced with the job guarantee program. And the Phillips curve will also is caused by the conflict between labor and management, and this conflict can be moderated if the government acts as an employer of last resort. And this will create stability, and this will reduce business cycles. Basically, the conflict between management and labor will take a different form when the government is a big employer. It will not be eliminated, but it requires management in a different way. So, what exactly was this war on poverty? This is what we will discuss. And basically the idea is that this was based on wrong theories about the causes of poverty. So basically the war on poverty focused on upgradation of worker skills. So we need to improve education, skills, and incentives, in the sense that one of the ideas is that people don't want to work at going wages, so we have to motivate them to work. So there were a huge number of programs launched along these lines in the USA and globally. Also in Pakistan, when you talk about creating jobs, then you talk about skills and TEVTA and education and etc. And Minsky says that this is a red herring. This is not how you create jobs. What this approach can do is that it can make the spread of poverty. Once you understand, see the neoclassical theory is based on the supply side economy. It says that the amount of product is fixed. So if you pump money, then only thing that can happen is inflation. The Minsky approach says that the amount of jobs created by the private sector is fixed, and changing wages will not cause differences in that. As you change wages, what will happen? The share of labor and the capital power, that will change, but jobs will not be created. This is contrary to the classical theory, which says that if you lower wages, then you will create jobs. So the diagnosis on the basis of which the war on poverty was launched is the supply side diagnosis, that the workers don't have the skill. Jobs are there, but the workers are not either willing to work for them, or they don't have the skills to work for them. So we provide them with the skills and we provide them with the incentives. But if the fault lies on the demand side, there is a fixed number of jobs being created, then these issues cannot solve the problem. So the problem is lack of sufficient jobs. The training, if we give, it will redistribute the jobs. Previously, some other people got it, and now among the trained people, some people will get the jobs. But for every trained person who finds a job, someone will be displaced from the job. And the author of this book that we are reading says that, well, let's look at the empirical evidence to see which one is right. And he says that basically, if you look at the numbers, there are more people who are poor today than at the start of the war on poverty. And poverty has been heavily concentrated on the poor and unskilled families. And that this number, the unemployment within the poor and unskilled workers, has not changed over the war on poverty. So basically, the war on poverty has failed to address the key target population. So this is empirical evidence for the correctness of Minsky's views. So Clinton ended the AFDC program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and he said that we need to change our views. Instead of thinking of people as being dependent on our dole, we think of them as people, as workers who need help. But while this is sort of correct, there was no the workers who need help. This is half correct, and this is exactly why, I mean, there's a in this point Minsky would be agreed. But now the next step is where the problem comes in. The workers who need help, the jobs are there, but the workers are not trained to find the jobs. So the help they need is in getting the skills that they need to find the job that they want. Whereas Minsky says that the help they need is that the jobs need to be created in order to accommodate them. So again, it's supply side, demand side. In the supply side view, the job is there, but the worker is not ready for it, so you train him. In the Minsky view, the worker is there, but there are no jobs, so now you create a job by looking at who the worker is. So this is an entirely different mindset. So the economic theory of the time and the economic theory today says that a growing economy automatically creates the jobs. So to create job, we need growth. This is also today, if you look at the conversation which is taking place in newspapers and among the economists, they say, Imran Khan has promised millions of jobs, but the only way to do that is to have growth. And if growth is not coming because of various problems, so the promise cannot be fulfilled. So this is exactly the standard economic thinking, and this is wrong, but this is widespread and very deeply printed into minds. So it's very hard to change minds about this. So this was the Kennedy-Johnson approach, which was crafted by the Council of Economic Advisors, who were deeply brainwashed into this model of how the job creation will take place. And they were all following the Keynesian approach. So the idea of the war on poverty is to upgrade the skills of the workers, and those who can't work, they are given welfare. It's up to the private sector to create jobs, but the result of this war, which was designed along these lines by the Council of Economic Advisors, was that there was an upward trend in unemployment, there was no change in poverty, and there was heavy poverty and unemployment in the poorest segments of the population. The book, The Other America, highlighted the stubborn problems of poverty in the midst of plenty. So basically, the outcomes support the Minsky view and are contrary to the classical economics theory view. The empirical evidence on what happened as a result of war on poverty was that the growth, which is supposed to create the jobs, basically one of the things that is strongly embedded in the mindset of the economists is that the government should not be in the business of providing jobs. That should be left to the private sector, and the only way the private sector will create jobs is if there is growth. And so if we have growth, then what happens is that this favors the already rich, the haves over the have. Jobs do not trickle down. So as the growing economy creates more jobs, these jobs are available only to the upper segments of society, and they are not available to the poor. There was, if you look at the data, you find in the war of poverty that there is some success, some reduction in poverty. And so what Randall Ray says is that this is true, but this came from the introduction of the Social Security program, not from the provision of jobs. So it's misleading. So all gains against poverty have come not due to the war on poverty or job creation or growth, they have come from Social Security. And basically Minsky predicted these outcomes. He said that the war on poverty will fail to create jobs, the poorest segments of the society will be left behind, there will be increasing inequality, and this will lead to gated communities. There are some people who are very rich, and they are so rich that they need to build fences around them to prevent the poor from coming in, because that will cause, there will be, when there is high levels of inequality, then there is high levels of crime, because people see that there are lots of people who are enjoying very high standards, and they don't see it as just, and it is not just. So the war on poverty was based on economic theories which do not recognize or understand the nature of poverty and the nature of the labor market, and they take measures which will not work in eliminating poverty. So what was the theory behind the war on poverty? We've already now the thing is that Johnson declared that this is an unconditional war on poverty, we are going to eliminate. So the intention was there. The Council of Economic Advisors also, it was not that these were people who were secret capitalists and they were trying to favor, they really wanted to eliminate poverty, but the theory they had about how poverty exists was wrong, and they took actions based on the wrong theories. And the same thing is happening in Pakistan today. Imran Khan is completely sincere about his intention to eliminate poverty, and Asad Umar is completely sincere about his desire to help the weaker segments. But the theories that they have, and the theories that are in the minds of all of the economists in the country who are designing these programs, and the non-economists learn from the economists. They ask, and so the economists tell them the wrong theory. So again, the ideas which are being used today to design job creation strategies are the wrong ideas, and they will fail to work. So the war on poverty were designed around the Economic Opportunity Act. According to Johnson, this plan was designed to deal with the causes of poverty rather than simply trying to take care of its consequences. So Social Security takes care of the consequences, you provide. This takes care of the consequences of poverty, you provide some food to the poor or some minimal amount of money. But causes of poverty is to try to find out why poverty exists and try to eliminate the cause. By expanding educational and training opportunities for the poor, Johnson thought that it would be possible to end poverty forever. So if the workers were just better educated and better skilled, then they would not be poor. This was the wrong diagnosis on which the war on poverty was designed, and which we are working today. So Johnson declared a total commitment to pursue victory over the most ancient of mankind's enemies, that is poverty. Now again, we have to understand that poverty becomes a problem within capitalism, because in capitalism it's understood that people can only get food if they have money to pay for it. In Islamic economic system, this is not true. The responsibility to feed and educate all the members of society is the collective responsibility, farz-e-kifaya on everyone. So if there is one child who is hungry in Pakistan, it is my responsibility and your responsibility if we have more than enough food. So this is an entirely different concept, and this is certainly not the capitalist concept. But today we are all capitalists, whether you are Muslim or not. The way the hegemony works is that the ideas that are dominant become part of the thinking of everybody on the planet. So in Minsky's, so the poverty is not itself a problem unless you have capitalism, and the economic theory says that everybody who wants to work at the going wage can find a job. So the only problem is, so if there is unemployment, it is because the workers don't want to work, they are on vacation, and maybe they are on vacation because the jobs that they have are not giving enough pay at the skill level that they have. So if we give them more skills, they will be able to find the jobs which have higher wage, so then they will be induced to work. So this starts with a completely wrong, that the workers are willing to work at the existing wages, but there are not enough jobs. So Minsky thought that this act focuses on preparing workers for jobs that do not exist, and it will fail. Only a targeted jobs program which pays decent wages would successfully fight poverty in a politically acceptable way. So the question is, why did the war on poverty downplay job creation? Because both Kennedy and Johnson relied on their economists. Same thing happened here. A task force was created to to study how we can get more jobs, and basically they came up with the recommendation that the government should not create jobs, it should allow the private sector to create jobs and just provide incentives to the private sector to make sure that they hire more people, and that involves growth. So what do the economists think, and what did they think? Basically, one is that poverty is not linked to unemployment. This is one of the key differences with Minsky. Unemployment can be reduced through fiscal policy. You can go to zero employment. And if you actually take Minsky seriously, then you have to hire millions of people, and this would not be possible without massive deficit spending, which would lead to massive inflation. So these are still the dominant views among economists. So basically, ignorant economists created wrong policies then, and they are doing so today. The structuralist views of unemployment, which are basically the common man on the street, does not have the economist's view, and so Imran Khan does not have these views. And he has the right intuitive views about poverty. The structure of the economy is such that it cannot create enough jobs, so you have to supplement that. But when they turned the job over to the Council of Economic Advisors, they convinced the people that, look, your intuitions are wrong, we are experts, we know what's going on, and we'll tell you that this is not what you think is not correct, even though what the people thought was correct and the economists thought was wrong. But that's why the plan was made according to the economist theories and not according to the simple ideas. So the structuralist view says that the demand stimulus, which is based on the Keynesian policy, that basically there's insufficient aggregate demand, So what you do is you pursue monetary policy or fiscal policy to create additional aggregate demand. So this was, Minsky thought that this will not generate enough jobs where they were most needed, by the low-skilled workers and by the African Americans. So whereas the public believed that we should have 2% employment, they said that if you go below 4%, you will start generating inflationary stress. And so they said, well, 4% is zero employment, even though when you were at 4% unemployment, then the black unemployment rates are in the neighborhood of 15% or so. Even if it had been successful, the war on poverty would not have made a big difference to the low-skilled workers and the African Americans in the USA. So as opposed to this, the Minsky view is that we create the jobs for the poor as they are. Don't give them, don't look for educating them and providing them with skills. Find the jobs which they can do in their current situation. Basically, the Keynesian theories of the time convinced the president that jobs program is not necessary, and the theory that first you must change the poor are responsible for their own poverty, unless they change, they cannot get jobs. So Minsky said that no, you take them as they are, you give them jobs which planting trees, anybody can do that. Growing tomatoes in the cities. There are hundreds of jobs which you can give to the poor as they are. And then when you give them jobs, then you provide them with on-the-job training to provide them with more skills. So suppose they are planting trees, then you teach them how to plant trees better. You teach them more botany, more about plants, and basically whatever jobs you give them, green jobs. So basically give them jobs and provide them with on-the-job. That will give them the skills that you need. And he thought that Keynesian approach would not work because it would create instability. We'll see this argument later. So basically Minsky's assessment of the war on poverty, which took place contrary to his theories, he said that he said that basically the war on poverty was an attempt by free marketeers to answer the major objection to capitalism, which is that it creates poverty, it creates inequality, it keeps the poor locked out of opportunities. So they were trying to answer this by saying, okay, yes, capitalism has these problems and we can solve these problems. The standard critique of capitalism by Polanyi is that it creates poverty, actually. So the answer that was given by the Warren was the wrong answer. And instead of providing the poor with an opportunity to work, which is what Minsky advocates, it provided them with the opportunity to learn how to work. So they were given the training. So these are the different mindsets. So basically, the problem of capitalism that they were trying to address, they could not solve because they had the wrong theories. So the right theory is that the structure of the economy is such that it will automatically generate unemployment, and unemployment will automatically generate poverty. The economic system is structured to generate unemployment. Unemployment is not due to the shortcomings of the workers. If the system generates a certain number of jobs and there are a certain number of people, then there will be unemployment by counting. And it is not the fault of the workers for not being able to find jobs. and it is not the question of demand and supply, where the number of jobs will vary according to the wage. This is what the standard theory says, that if you reduce the wages, more jobs will come into existence. But this is not in accordance with what really happens. The structure of the economy does not change. If you change the wages, this will not produce more jobs. So once you understand this diagnosis, that unemployment is not due to shortcomings of the workers, it's just a structural mismatch between the number of jobs and the number of employed, then you see that the supply side solutions cannot work. Training, education, providing incentives to work, better working conditions, for example, this is just not going to do the problem, because one is the number of jobs and the number of workers that aren't matched. Nothing can solve that problem. So the solution then is that you must provide additional jobs, and since the private sector is not going to provide the jobs, you must provide them in the public sector. So the Keynesian demand stimulus policies, which basically try to make sure that the private sector expands sufficiently and provides jobs, these are not going to work. 10 years after the war on policy in 1975, Minsky said that we have to reverse the thrust of policy of the past 40 years. Any policy strategy which does not take job creation as its first and primary objective is a continuation of the impoverishing strategy of the past decade. So he says that this strategy actually creates more poor, and this is what's going to happen. So these programs which are supposed to fight poverty are going to create poverty. He said that basically the post-war strategies have proven ineffective, so we should go to pre-war strategies, which were creation of public works programs. What happened in post-World War II can be seen as a victory for Keynes, in the sense that Keynesian programs were implemented, and it can be seen as a defeat of the real anti-poverty programs, because Keynesian policies did not actually lead to reduction in poverty. So we will see that what Keynes and economists think of as full employment is very different from what Minsky thinks of as full employment. So basically, the true story of how we can fight poverty was never in the picture. There was a battle between Keynes and Chicago, and Keynes won this war in post-war period for a while, and this basically, the Keynesian theory says that we need to worry about aggregate demand, and this was widely accepted for a while, but even this was not sufficient to make a dent in poverty. So the victory of Keynes was actually the defeat of anti-poverty program. So basically the Minsky theory says that poverty is due to unemployment, either unemployment or underemployment. Basically either people are jobless or they don't have enough work. They work for a few hours when they would like to work for more, or their wages are very low, so that they don't earn enough. And once this is true, if you have unemployment or underemployment or low wage employment, then this will lead to expansion in poverty. So once you have expansion in poverty, then you need better welfare programs. But Minsky says that, see, welfare programs are not the solution for poverty. The welfare programs are the requirement of our conscience and our social responsibility, but they don't have to do with poverty. He thought that poverty had to do with basically providing jobs. So Minsky is in favor of system of welfare for those who cannot work, but basically he is much more in favor of providing work, and he thinks that if we provide work, that will automatically take care of the problem of poverty, because social networks will be sufficient to provide for those who are unable to work. So what he wants was a comprehensive jobs program and effective and adequate minimum wages. So he says that the minimum wage program we have is not true a minimum wage, because it's a minimum wage for the one who can find a job, but the person who can't find a job has zero wage, and that's the effective minimum wage, and that's what he doesn't want. There should be a real minimum wage, that is, everybody should be able to earn a minimum amount of money per hour, and that would be Minsky's solution. So what Minsky advocates is what he calls tight full employment. So the rate should be 2.5% instead of 5.2%. He thought that, using that time statistics, that if you actually employ 2.5% more workers, this will increase the GNP by 34 billion, and the cost of running such a program would only be 11 to 12 billion. So if you employ more workers, the output they will produce will be worth a lot more than the cost that it is of hiring them. So putting people to work would generate 3 to 5 times as much output as would be required to pay them the wages to bring everybody above poverty line. Even at the peak of the job cycle, when you are supposedly at full employment with zero output gap, there is some job mismatch. The jobs that are available are not matched to the skills that are available, and to eliminate that, basically you have to retrain workers, but the problem is that these theories don't cater to the bottom of the job pool. The low-skilled workers require too much training, and the economy is changing dynamically. So even though it keeps generating new jobs, you provide training, but at the end of 2 years you find that the skills they have are no longer relevant to the jobs that exist. Training has a long gestation period. In a dynamic, rapidly changing economy, we cannot anticipate the training requirements that, okay, we prepare them for. So that's why you need to hire the workers as they are and give them on-the-job training. So instead of training workers for future jobs, find jobs for existing workforce. We need active labor market policies, that is, take the workers as they are and try to find jobs for them, and direct job creation programs for people who are structurally displaced. So some type of workers, some industry shuts down, like some obsolete technology. So you have to take those workers and then you have to see what they can do and provide them with jobs that are suitable to their skills. Capabilities are determined in early childhood, and the skills are continuously changing. So the idea of training people to match job requirements for the future is just not possible. The time period between the training and the job is too large, and there will always be a mismatch. So instead of trying to fit the workers into the jobs, you need to fit the jobs to the workers. So what was the outcome of this war on poverty? So the poverty rates declined to 15% from World War II to 1965 at the start of the war on poverty. And as we said earlier, this early decline in poverty was mainly due to expansion of the social welfare programs, and it was not due to provision of jobs to the poor. From the mid-60s onwards to 2000, there is no significant decline in poverty. It was around 12% in 68 and also in 2000. So then the question arises, according to Minsky, this is due to unemployment, whereas in neoclassical theory there is no link between unemployment and poverty. So basically, using their own data, they find that if you have a family with one full-time worker, the poverty rate is around 3.5%. If you have a family with less than one full-time worker, the poverty rate is around 25%. So this shows clearly the importance of jobs and the link to poverty. So in 1965, the high school dropout rate was 62%, and in 1999, 68%, and more than 2/3 of the black youth are unemployed. At the peak of the war and poverty, even in times which our labor market is tight, there is supposed to be full employment. Black youth have 66% unemployment rate, which just shows that it doesn't create jobs. It creates, it provides jobs to those who have higher skills, which means the better off, the middle class, and not the poorest. So the traditional economic theory there and the traditional economic theory here says that the way to reduce poverty is via an investment strategy. Basically, if we have more private investment, that will create higher aggregate demand, and it will create expand the capabilities of the economy. It will create growth, and that is the way to create jobs. So how do we do that? We provide tax cuts for business people, so they will create more investment. We provide them with loopholes for capital, so that the capital expansion can take place, and we shift resources to private consumption and investment to create aggregate demand. These are the key elements of a Keynesian strategy. Keynesian strategy says that the aggregate demand is what drives the economy, and then it says that basically consumption is driven by GNP. GNP is driven by aggregate demand. The exogenous element which drives the aggregate demand is investment. Investment is determined by expectations. So the key is to focus on investments. That's the standard Keynesian theory. That if the only place where we can intervene is the investment. The consumption we can't intervene because consumption is endogenous. So we can't really increase aggregate demand for consumption directly. But if we increase investment, that leads to a multiplier effect on the aggregate demand, and it also has an accelerator effect. What's the accelerator? It's the productive capacity of the economy is increased because you have more capital. So the growth process is accelerated. So the policies designed with this theoretical framework said that, okay, one of the things that causes problem is that the investors have expectations about the future which are uncertain. So let's increase the certainty of the return to capital. So the government provide guaranteed profit schemes for investments in defense and in transportation and in housing, in many other places. Part of this was also bailing out failing businesses. So basically you provide a backstop. So basically you ensure that the businesses earn profits so that they have a confidence in the environment, so they will invest. So once you have investment, then the multiplier accelerator should create growth and jobs. So according to Minsky, there are 4 problems with this investment-based growth strategy. On the one hand, you have tax breaks for investors, and this leads to increasing inequality because the capitalists have the money, and they are the ones who are investing, and they are going to make the profits. So although you're going to create jobs, you're also going to create increasing inequality. This inequality will create luxury consumption. Capitalists will have higher and higher living standards. Envy and demand pull inflation, because you have lots of money, you are willing to spend extravagantly on products, and we see some of that here also, that there is a small segment in Pakistan society which is very rich, and they have plenty of money to burn on anything. So this creates inflation, which adversely affects the middle classes and the poor, because the products which would be cheaper if there was not that much high demand are now expensive. Now if you invest in capital, as what's happening, you're going to have capital accumulation. This will lead to a demand for skilled labor, but not for unskilled labor. So this will, again, we'll say, okay, we need to train the workforce, but the big segments of the unskilled, uneducated laborers will not be affected by this. And finally, if you make sure that business capital is earning solid returns, this is exactly what's going to lead to increasing financial fragility and eventually crisis, because basically you're guaranteeing returns to capital, so more and more credit will be created. So we look at empirically the performance of Minsky's ideas in the Clinton boom of 1990s. And this period, following the standard theories, the government budget was in surplus. The boom was financed by borrowing. So basically we had, as you know, the private sector surplus must come from some other sector, and in this case it was by debt. The financial sector was injecting capital into the business sector, and so basically the consumers were taking debt to buy, and the businesses were taking debt to invest. So there was a boom in aggregate demand, but it was financed by debt. But this is what led to the collapse, because debt-fueled growth is not sustainable. And this was actually due to Keynesian policy, that you provide monetary stimulus and let the private sector create jobs and investment. So monetary stimulus allowed the banks to create money, and this led to private sector expansion, but it was based on dangerous levels of debt. So one of the key Minsky insights is that the Keynesian policy, which says that, okay, we are at unemployment, we have output gaps, so let's follow this policy and get to full employment. A policy which gets you to full employment is not enough to maintain full employment. So you can get there, but you can't stay there, because full employment itself is unstable. To give a more mundane example, you see, people diet to achieve the right weight, but it turns out that that is the easy part of the dieting. The hard part is to maintain your weight at the low level. So getting to full employment is not the problem, it's staying at full employment that is the problem. Demand stimulus will lead you to full employment, but that once you are at full employment, this will create financial fragility, because there will be credit creation, and that will lead to inflation, because you are now at full employment, and once you are having inflation, then the central bank will put on the brakes, and that will lead to a collapse. And that's exactly what's happening in Pakistan today. This will be a stop-go policy, because once you have collapsed, then the economy will go into recession, you will have unemployment, and then you will say start again with your Keynesian stimulus. So this is exactly stop-go policy. Now you can have the government coming in And even in unemployment, you can the government can support businesses, as exactly what happened in the global financial crisis, that the businesses did not suffer from loss of profits even though there was major crisis. This will lead to increasing financial fragility, because the more confidence that the business have that they will not suffer losses, the more credit they will create even when the economy is in recession. So the alternative to all of this is the public employment strategies, which is the ELR proposal, the employer of the last resort. So what Minsky asks for is that we should, instead of investment-based growth, we should have consumption-based growth. Well, now this is a new idea. This is not coming out of Keynes. So consumption is financed out of income, and it should not be financed out of debt. You can also have debt-based consumption growth. That would not be stable. That did happen actually. So there should be high consumption, and this high consumption would come from the income and the wages at the bottom of the pool. The government spending is needed to create jobs at the bottom. If we let this be done by the private sector, if we let the financial sector create these jobs, then the financial sector will grow faster than households and firms, because they will be the drivers, so they will get profits. And so basically the financial sector is growing faster, then the credit creation will mean basically you look at the intersectoral balances, the fact that they are increasing profits means that the households and firms will be increasing in debt, and this will not be sustainable in the long run. So that will also lead to crashes. So basically, if you really want to run a war on poverty, then you have to think about how to improve the income distribution, which is exactly the opposite of the neoclassical theories. How can we quickly and in the short run improve the income distribution? According to Minsky, what we need to do is achieve and sustain tight full employment. This means that across a broad section of occupations, industries, and locations, employers want to hire more workers. Job vacancies are there everywhere, and job seekers are not there. So this is what he means by tight full employment. In order to do this, you need bolder, more imaginative, and more consistent use of expansionary monetary policies than we have witnessed to date. The achievement and sustaining of tight full employment could do almost all of the job of eliminating poverty. A large portion of those living in poverty, and even a larger portion of those living close to poverty, are there because they receive very little income from work, or they do not work. So this is the Minskyan diagnosis, which is different from the conventional. So the key to handling this problem is the employer of the last resort, and this would be a job guarantee program similar to the New Deal's Work Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, National Youth Administration programs. So these are the types of programs that we need today. If you have a large scale job guarantee program, then this sets the wage of the unskilled labor, and you provide jobs as needed to the number of people who need work. So this has 4 advantages according to Minsky. It will eliminate poverty due to unemployment. So this is the opposite of the conventional trickle-down approach. The trickle-down approach says that just let the economy grow, and this will automatically create prosperity and jobs, and these will trickle down to the poor. As opposed to this, we go directly and give jobs to the poorest people. So the way to do this is you take unskilled and illiterate people and you provide them with on-the-job training, giving them jobs that they can currently do. Tight labor markets will draw attract more workers. Now, this is a new aspect that if you really provide jobs to all, then lots of people who are currently out of the labor force, they're not looking for jobs, they will be attracted into the labor force because jobs are plentifully available. And they don't have to compete to find jobs. They don't have to upskill and upgrade themselves. This will lead to improved income distribution, and it will reduce the share of capital in the output of the economy. Now, income and consumption-based growth is not fragile, contrary to credit-based and financial-based growth. So, ELR is far more ambitious than the demand stimulus of Keynes. All those people who are willing to work are offered jobs. Many who are out of the labor pool will accept this offer. So the official statistic will not explain. And the official statistics might be that there, in fact, this is what they calculated, that the official unemployment was at 4 million. But if you offer a job guarantee, 14 million people will be interested in getting jobs. So the official rates are biased and vastly understate the potential of these job guarantee programs. So what are the barriers to putting this program into operation? There are a lot of them. First of all, there are people who will say that this is pie in the sky, this cannot be done, you can't give, this is like just a dream. Why? Because there's an irrational prejudice against spending, deficits, easy money. All of these things are, and you can't imagine. Basically, people say that the government can't spend, the government can't give jobs, even though in China the government provides, the government sector is about 75% of the economy, so they are providing jobs and they have had the best growth over the past few decades. But people will say, no, this cannot be done. You can't give jobs to everybody. You can't do deficit spending. You can't print money easily. So these are some irrational objections, which will nonetheless, these are very strong objections, but there are some real objections there. If the policy is poorly designed, then it can create problems which will cause failure, even though it was potentially possible to succeed. So we can design a job creation program, but if it turns out that only the politically favored get jobs and they get these jobs and they don't do anything, then this will create a lot of resentment and a lot of political fallback, which will cause the program to fail, even though it was possible for such a program to succeed. And once the program fails, they will say, look, we've tried it and it doesn't work. The program does have an inflationary bias. If you give a lot of money to a lot of poor people, this will generate a lot of aggregate demand. If the productivity is not there to match, then this will create inflation. Now, as we have discussed, so this means that you can't just design any kind of job program. You have to design it intelligently. You have to anticipate what will be the demand, extra demand that will come in. And there will be a huge amount of extra demand that will come in if you give a lot of money to a lot of people. So you have to make sure that that extra demand is fulfilled. And the first demand will be for food. So you have to make sure that if you're hiring millions of people, a suitable subset of them is devoted to increasing agricultural product. And it's easy. Growing vegetables, anybody can do in Pakistan because we have plenty of land. So we are blessed with the resources. It's not always true in a landlocked or small country like Singapore. You would not be able to put people directly to work on producing food. So what you would do is you would put them to work on producing some cheap export which can be traded for food or something like that. I mean, you have to design the program intelligently. And food is just one thing, then you look at what are the current demands of the bottom population. You go and look at your household income expenditure survey and you ask what do the poorest people spend on, and then from there you can calculate what the demands will be generated, and then you have to make sure that those demands will be fulfilled. If you don't, then there will be inflation. Now, in addition, there will be, once you have lots of money available, then this will also flow to the high product industries. People will want to buy goods, and you have to make sure that there are price controls. They should not be able to increase their prices, otherwise this will lead to inflation. Keeping inflation in check would be necessary for the political popularity of the program. Otherwise, if there is massive inflation created, people will say that this program does not work. So he says that today this is not a serious problem because inflationary pressures are low. All over there's technology, which innovations which make the wage demand low. There's also global competition which makes the wage demand low, and that breaks the wage price spiral. Wage growth remains in line with productivity growth. That's one thing. The second very important thing is the exchange rate barrier. Many people with whom I have discussed this said that, well, all of this is good in Australia and USA, but it will not work in Pakistan. And this is true if you have overvalued exchange rates, because basically what we're looking at is we're giving a lot of money to a lot of people, and if they start buying imports, then currently we have an overvalued rupee, and so every time you buy an import, the government has to pay money to subsidize that. So we can't afford that. But exactly the opposite happens when you have an undervalued rupee, because now when the rupees are used to buy imports, then you are actually gaining money on the transaction. Just as you have to pump dollars in, as the if the rupee is undervalued, then the dollars are pumped out of the system. When you print money and you buy, the demand for rupees is greater than the supply, so the state bank can print money and buy dollars while keeping the price of rupee low. So if you have floating exchange rate, then there is no gain. Actually, this is how Japan and China accumulated trillions of dollars of reserves, because they kept the value of their currency low. So exactly the opposite of what the public thinks, that a strong rupee means a strong economy. Actually, this gets the causal sequence wrong. They think that if our economy is strong, that will lead to a strong rupee. But actually, the value of the rupee is something which is a policy variable, and as a policy, we can keep the value of the rupee low, and that if we keep it low, that will is an industrial policy that will make our products cheaper for the outside, that will create larger aggregate demand for our products, and also the extra money that we provide will not lead to an inflationary bias in terms of leading to a spending spree for foreign products which will bankrupt the economy. Actually, the foreign products that we buy will be very expensive relative to their real price. So the more we buy, the better we are. That will not cause inflation. So basically, the inflationary bias can be eliminated. So this policy of MMT can be applied in Pakistan if we have either floating exchange rates or undervalued. undervalued is better than floating in this situation. Undervaluation has the additional, you see, floating has the effect of making the exchange rate extremely erratic because you leave it to market forces, and that causes. So if you want to maintain the exchange rate, then you can maintain it at an undervalued figure. But this requires a very skillful economic management, because you can't, and you have to keep track of it, and you have to maintain it at a certain. And for example, suppose you want to maintain it 5% undervalued, and you have to be precise, because if you change this, your economic incentive structures, your industries will collapse or they will emerge. So this is sort of a hidden variable which nobody thinks of. But basically, in Pakistan, many people have said we tried the import substitution strategy and it failed. And it is true. This is what happened in Pakistan. But actually this was because of the overvaluation of the exchange rate. If we had kept the exchange rate undervalued, imports would have been expensive. Local import substitution industries would have succeeded. But if the rupee is overvalued, then local even tomato producers cannot succeed against the tomatoes of India. So this is a hidden variable. People don't understand this. People think that import substitution failed because our manufacturers are lazy and our workers don't have the right skills. But the reason is actually different from that. So this exchange rate is extremely important when it comes to implementing this job guarantee program. So what are the conclusions? Now, in the eyes of most economists, including myself, I used to think this until I have been, my views have been changing rapidly in response to what I have been reading. Basically, we all thought that post-60s Keynesian worked wonderfully and it created prosperity. But actually, these strategies based on increasing investment, which dominated and which were the golden age of US capitalism, contained the seeds for its own destruction, because they did not address poverty. They were based on investment based, they were based on capital accumulation, and as we have discussed, this is sort of a self-destructive system and it cannot create tight full employment. So what Minsky's prescription is that poverty is largely an employment problem. Tight full employment improves income at the bottom wage of the wage spectrum. Direct job creation is necessary to sustain tight full employment. So all of these are highly unfashionable ideas, very difficult to sell, because everybody says that in order to create a strong economy, we have to have a dynamic private sector, and the government should not it is not the business of the government to get in business. And look at the steel mills and look at PIA. So obviously this is the wrong approach. So not only do you have the so the theories that we are saying here is that no, government should be doing more job creation. So this is exactly the opposite of what everybody believes, and exactly the opposite of what the empirical evidence seems to show, in Pakistan at least. But we can look at Dubai. They used unskilled and uneducated laborers of ours to build the whole city, and so it is possible to do. As I said, a badly designed program will fail and will create resistance to such policies in the future, even though a correctly designed program can succeed. Basically, all growth, all dynamic growth in the past all economies which have transformed from agrarian to industrial economies in the 20th century have been guided by government. There has been no cases where a weak and poor government but a dynamic private sector has transformed an economy. It hasn't happened throughout history. So, but lots of governments have tried, and lots of governments have failed very miserably and have done very badly. So the question is that basically there is a battle that needs to be fought in order to win. Now, when you fight the battle, sometimes you will win, sometimes you will lose. But if you say that let's not fight, then you have given up the game already. So the issue is how to fight and win. The private market, the free market strategy is to just give up without fighting. Why? Because we see so many governments who fought and they all lost, so we will also lose. But we see also some governments which fought and won. So the point is to try to be like the ones which won rather than giving up by seeing all of the failures. So the question is, how can we win this game, which is difficult but not impossible. So these are the things which need to be done, but we can all see why it would fail. I mean, we can all see that if we had a large job creation program, how it could easily go wrong. But we can also see how it could be made to go right. There are ways to do these things, and these are also known, and we have a lot of experience in designing programs. We have a lot of experience with failures and a lot of experience with successes as well. So this needs to be done, but the point is at this moment nobody is even thinking about doing these things. So if you think about these things, then you can ask, okay, what will fail and what will not. So direct job creation is a necessary ingredient of any war against poverty. This was done in the New Deal by the Roosevelt administration, and this needs to be done. The Johnson's economic program that was undertaken in 1960s did not have these elements, and that's why it failed. Education and training programs will not work, and this is the standard economic theory. And the reason for this is that they take too long to work, even when they work. So basically, if we say education and skills, then it means that those people who have already been born and they are already uneducated, we want to improve education and skills. There's no doubt about that, but that's not going to eliminate poverty. It's putting the horse before the cart, basically. That's what Minsky says, that first you give them skills, then you give them jobs. No, first give them jobs, then you give them the skills. And once you do that, the skills will be aligned with the jobs, and says that throwing the ball before you have it. This is a baseball. Right, I think I'll stop here.